Good morning and welcome to another edition of Oregon Bio's Makers and Biomarkers. Before we begin, we'd like to thank Oregon Bio's Platinum level members whose support has made this program possible. They include ABSci, Biotronic, CAI, Genentech, Microsystems Engineering, Pharma, Skanska, Twist, and VWR. Today, Oregon Bio welcomes Acer Therapeutics to our program. Our panelist is Tanya Hayden, Vice President, Project and Strategic Alliance Management at Acer Therapeutics. Our topic, Acer, Developing Therapies for Rare Diseases. And again, thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to welcome Tanya to the program. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I'm excited to be here today and share a little bit about Acer Therapeutics. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to share just a little bit about Acer Therapeutics, who we are, what we do, and then take you through a bit of our pipeline. Specifically, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the compound that we have closest to becoming a marketed therapeutic. But if we have time, we'll go through some of our other programs as well. As we get started, Acer is a public company, so I have to officially put out our disclosure there that neither I nor my colleagues have been able to predict the future, and we haven't mastered time travel or anything like that yet. So please take all of my statements accordingly. So I suppose to follow on with that disclosure, I'll add that I've only been with Acer Therapeutics since June of this year, June of 2021. I've been in the industry for more than 20 years, but only recently had an opportunity to join Acer. And I was enthusiastic to do so because I really wanted to have an opportunity to be close to the patient, to be a part of a small emerging pharmaceutical company that was really looking at how do we treat those patients that maybe have been left behind. Either it's a rare disease or maybe it's a niche of suffering. And in other words, I tell my friends I joined a company that looks for opportunity where others may have not seen any. The company was founded in 2013 by our CEO, Chris Schelling, and went public in 2017. And what I think is kind of interesting about Acer is we define ourselves as a flexible work environment. What that means is that our now 31 colleagues are spread out across the United States, but we have no formal lab or clinical facilities, no manufacturing facility, but we do have two offices. One in Newton, Massachusetts, and then one in Bend, Oregon, where I'm located. And that allows us to get together and continue to have that face-to-face innovation every now and again. We remain small, but we do have 4 different products that we're looking at developing in our pipeline. So we look across the pipeline. The top program there in that yellow, that's Acer 001. The compound name is sodium phenylbutyrate. And this is the one that I'd like to go into a little bit more detail with everybody today, as we're hoping to have commercial approval for it in 2022. As we go down the list, there's some additional programs I'll summarize just briefly. Acer 801 Osanatan. This is for treating induced vasomotor symptoms. You might know those as hot flashes. Typically, that is connected with women going through menopause, but this can also be a pretty serious complication for folks who are undergoing cancer treatment. It's a type of compound that has been demonstrated to have both good safety profiles and good efficacy, but has never been developed for that specific patient population. In the orange there, we have the trademark named Sibo Saliperolol. This is a compound that is a beta blocker available in other parts of the world, but has never been introduced to the US. And it does support a group of patients with vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a particular genotype of that. And there are no treatments that are currently available to them in the United States. So Acer has been looking at ways to bring that drug to market here in the United States. And then finally, at the bottom, Acer 2820 emetine, just in early discussions in development, but looking at this as a broad spectrum antiviral against a variety of different viruses. So again, I want to take a little bit of time to go through The first one across the top there, Acer 001 for urea cycle disorders. Urea cycle disorders is sort of a broad umbrella term for a group of metabolic genetic diseases that interrupts one's ability to process and excrete additional nitrogen that comes as ammonia. So in other words, patients who are suffering from this might have a real difficulty with protein consumption, for example. There aren't a huge number of patients with this. We estimate only a couple thousand in the United States. And of those, maybe 1,000 of them actually have a diagnosis and know that they are living with this disease. Once they know that they have this, usually they can be treated with a combination of pretty strict diet restrictions as well as taking a prescription ammonia scavenger. When somebody is suffering from a urea cycle disorder, they have a buildup of this ammonia in their blood, events that we call hyperammonemia. And these events can lead to anything from, I'll say mild, but still certainly uncomfortable symptoms such as fatigue and nausea, but it can also lead to long-term, more detrimental effects, developmental delays, especially in early onset UCD. You can have intellectual disabilities, you can have issues with focus, and ultimately this can be a fatal disorder. So it's a pretty significant issue and one that only affects a small number of patients. I'm not going to go too much into the mechanism of action for these ammonia scavengers, other than to say, generally, the way that the therapies work is you have, your body has the ability to process your ammonia, and we are just providing opportunities for the body to make additional PAA, phenylacetic acid, which binds with the glutamine carrying that ammonia group and ultimately can be excreted in the urine. And the other thing I'll say here is, while Acer 001 will work here at phenylbutyric acid, there are also two other treatments that are already on the market. There's buphenol, sodium phenylbutyrate, which is just the same as Acer 001. And then there's also Ravicti, which is just a step prior to that. They all work in essentially the same way, which is to create this sink, if you will, for ammonia to be excreted. But they are slightly different. As you're looking at this, you might be thinking, well, okay, if there's only 1,000 patients who even know that they have this disease in the United States, and there's two therapies on the market, what's the big deal? But again, I think Acer looked for a need where others maybe thought there wasn't one. And what we were hearing from both patients and caretakers alike is that the treatments that are available to these patients simply aren't getting it done. The patient outcomes aren't what we'd like them to be. For buphenol, it's a foul odor, foul, nasty, bitter taste. It really is considered unpalatable. When you think about it, sodium phenylbutyrate, butyrate is a short chain fatty acid, and you might be familiar with it as it is a primary component in the taste of vomit. So definitely unpleasant. And these patients are having to take it in a powder form or as tablets, up to 40 tablets a day before that they consume a meal so that they can appropriately manage their ammonia concentration. Because of the taste, it's really difficult for patients to stay on therapy, and they will get lots of different side effects. This taste issue was solved with Ravicti, which is, it is formulated as an oil. So now instead of patients taking a ton of tablets, they can take just a couple of teaspoons or tablespoons of oil prior to a meal, which still doesn't sound super pleasant, but certainly it beats the odor and taste of buphenol. And the problem is, unfortunately, the cost of Ravicti has been increased year over year to the point where now the cost of treating a patient might be more than $1 million per year. And that's just proving to be unsustainable for our healthcare system. And a number of payers, a number of insurance companies have chosen to not pay for Ravicti, which forces patients back on the buphenol, which isn't well tolerated, and you end up with this horrible cycle. So Acer has really set out to develop a formulation that will be both taste masked and palatable, improve patient compatibility, but also will be sustainable and good steward of our healthcare system. And I'm excited to say that we anticipate approval for this drug in mid-2022. If you can look down below, there's just a comparison of the different drugs. And one thing I'll add is Acer 001 is formulated also for convenience. It's a taste masked multi-particulate formulation that will be provided in pre-weighed sachets. So the UCD patient can take their sachet with them, head out the door for whatever their events are going to be for the day. And prior to taking a meal, they open up their pre-weighed sachet, create a suspension in a bit of water, consume their suspension, and off they go. So we hope that not only are we providing a product that works at least as well, but that it is also more favorable for the patients to take, and it's more convenient. And we hope to do so in a way that is also, again, responsible stewards of our current healthcare system with more of an orphan pricing.
How does Acer work with economics of fashioning solutions for small markets?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think Acer is well positioned to be able to provide these therapies to smaller patient populations because of the way that we are structured as the virtual organization. We run very lean. We work with a whole lot of partners, everything from universities, other pharmaceutical companies. We have a lot of consultants and certainly a lot of service providers, whether that is a manufacturing organization or a clinical study organization. Because of that, we don't have to carry the same amount of overhead that maybe a traditional pharmaceutical company would. And it allows us to be a little bit more creative with how we approach our pricing considerations. I do think that I like the way you said that it's a pragmatic approach. Chris Schelling, again, Acer's CEO, when I first joined the company, he described this process as looking at a stool with three legs. You've got the patients, you've got the healthcare providers, and then you have the payers, the insurance companies, essentially the system, if you will, that we have to work within. And what we are trying to do is really optimize the experience for all three. And I think that's bold and a little audacious, a little disruptive. That's not really the approach that's always taken, but I feel privileged to be a part of it.
Of course, we are going through a pandemic. And how has COVID impacted your work and your timelines and everything, really?
Yeah. Oh, the pandemic. So I joined Acer in June of 2021. So I largely did not experience the pandemic with Acer. But what was interesting is that I was hearing from my new colleagues that Acer was perfectly positioned to be a company that would withstand the pandemic because we are a flexible work environment, which means that we are mostly virtual. There's already a culture of collaborating and innovating using video chat functionality, which I think other companies maybe were coming up to speed on by nature of the pandemic, and Acer maybe already had that in their back pocket. Certainly, there have been challenges, though. Their service providers and all those partners and that network of support that I just discussed, they were all dealing with their own COVID challenges. So that did mean that we had to be creative about some of our timelines. But I don't think the company missed a beat with respect to internal collaboration, which has been pretty exciting. I will say, though, there has been only very few opportunities for everybody to get together face to face since the start of the pandemic. And we had a function not too long ago where we were able to get a number of folks together, provided everybody was vaccinated. And you could almost feel a sigh of relief from everyone to be able to have that opportunity to see each other in person.
I can imagine. I think we're all pretty much on the same page in different ways, navigating our ways through that. How would you compare the skill sets needed for success at, say, a larger global corporation compared to something that's your company, which is a small virtual entity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so prior to Acer, I was with Lonza, which is a much larger global company. And so I was a little nervous about making the shift from something so much more formal, so much larger, to sort of a small, scrappy, emerging biopharma. I'd say that the skill sets are largely similar. Anywhere that you go, you need to be a strong communicator. It helps to be a good writer, helps to be a quick learner, helps to be collaborative, and have a level of team engagement. I think what is perhaps more heavily weighed on in a smaller environment is you have to be really curious and self-driven. And because all of the engagement is remote and virtual, you're never going to have the new employee luncheon, where you go out and meet your new colleagues face to face. And so you have to be willing to really put out the branch first, and you have to be, I think, confident in that way.
Right, I can imagine that. And I'm relatively new in my role too, and it is a different experience starting employment virtually versus perhaps continuing virtually where you already have pre-existing relationships and so forth. It's a little different. How does Acer actually decide which diseases to work on?
It's a good question. It's fascinating. Chris Schelling, who would have been a far more impressive representative for the company than I am, he has a tremendous number of different connections with the academic and pharmaceutical industry. And he's always staying connected and looking for these opportunities, and also just with his own reading. If you look down this pipeline list here, you can see we're not a company that's going after any one rare disease or going after any one kind of population. It really is looking for opportunity where others have maybe abandoned the torch, if you will. Certainly for urea cycle disorders, that's a small patient population. For Sibo, it's the same situation. For Osanatan, it's more that there's a whole class of drugs that has a huge library of safety and efficacy data associated with it. But there's sort of a niche of patients. So it really does take some diligence. I think Chris probably already has a dozen or so potential candidates going in his mind that he's cycling through and working with opinion leaders and other experts in the area to really evaluate whether there's the potential for us to bring value to patients. So it's a bit of a process.
Right. Very good. I know you have a few more slides. Was there one or two that you would like to focus on?
No, maybe I can just go through very quickly the Osanatan, because as I mentioned, this is slightly different as opposed to going after a rare disease state with only 1,000 patients. This is really repurposing a class of drug and looking at it in a different way and how we might be able to treat people suffering from different kinds of symptoms. So as I mentioned, Osanatan, Acer 801, we're looking at this to treat vasomotor symptoms. And vasomotor symptoms are thought of as hot flashes and night sweats, often thought of associated with menopause because there's this tremendous decrease in the reproductive hormones. And when those reproductive hormones go away, the hypothalamus in the body kind of gets out of whack. And it will interpret signals as being too hot, and it'll start the body's ability to cool itself off. And that's what generates these night sweats. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just women going through menopause that are struggling with vasomotor symptoms. You can also have a class of patients that have induced vasomotor symptoms. So this affects both women and men. And it can really be a significant struggle as they go through recovery from either cancer-related surgery or just ongoing cancer therapy, where the therapy for cancer is such that it does impact the reproductive hormones in their system. But in doing so, they develop these side effects. So we are looking at developing a product that would sort of be supportive to that, reducing those side effects so that they can have a good night of sleep, so that they can rest well, which will help them with their overall recovery and patient outcomes associated with their surgery and cancer. And again, what's different about this one is there is a tremendous amount of data associated with this class of compounds called NK3R antagonists. And that's fancy for saying essentially these come in and they work very similar to estrogen. They trick the hypothalamus into thinking there is sufficient estrogen around, and it reduces the number and severity of these hot flashes. All sorts of data, but for various reasons, the companies that have been progressing these have decided not to progress. Maybe they didn't think that there was sufficient market going after the whole menopausal woman angle. Or maybe, as we already discussed, the economics were such that they didn't think it was worthwhile to develop for a very niche class of patients going through cancer treatments.
So that's a really interesting process of assuming the work that another entity has already worked on. What are some of the challenges in assuming a body of work that someone else has initiated?
Excellent question, Jeff, because that is a lot of what Acer has to do in order to maintain the economics, as we talked about, is really comb and look at what data has already been generated. But not being in control of those studies means we have to take the data as it is. We have to do our own diligence and evaluate the scientific rigor of that data. And then we have to work really closely and partner with the regulatory agency, with the FDA, to make sure that we understand, do we have a safe body of data that says that we're okay to progress into humans? Do we have reason to believe that this is going to be efficacious? It really takes a lot of collaboration with the FDA to be able to work this approach.
So we have a couple more minutes. I see you have this development plan on. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So this is just to say, this is an earlier stage product. We are not nearly as far down the road as we are with Acer 001, but we are looking at initiating a clinical trial in early 2022. And ultimately, we hope to progress this into patients such as those that are listed there, either women who are BRCA positive and are going through associated surgeries, or men who maybe are struggling with prostate cancer and receiving certain kinds of treatments that reduce their reproductive hormones. So I'm optimistic. I'm excited to see where this one leads us.
Terrific. Well, Tanya, I want to thank you so much. We are pretty much out of time. It's gone by really quickly. And there's so much interesting, we've got so many terrific initiatives here at Acer Therapeutics. I hope we have a chance to visit again down the line and get an update. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Tanya, for being our panelist today.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. And anybody can find more information about Acer Therapeutics on the internet, of course.
All right. Well, we're going to sign off now. So everyone, have a great day. We'll see you on the next episode of Makers and Biomarkers.
Thank you.